Washington, D.C. earned the nickname Chocolate City as a testament to its identity as one of the most prominent majority black cities in America. By the early 1970s, black residents comprised nearly 73% of the city's population. This made D.C. a rare urban space where African Americans held not just demographic dominance, but genuine political power. When Parliament immortalized the phrase in the 1975 funk anthem, they were celebrating something real, a city that belonged, in a meaningful sense, to black people. The 1970s marked a transformative era for D.C.'s black population. Home rule arrived in 1973, giving the district its first elected mayor and city council, and Walter Washington became the city's first black mayor in the urban era. When Marion Barry swept into office in 1978, he embodied the aspirations of Chocolate City in full, a fiery civil rights veteran who built a governing coalition rooted in black working class and poor communities, expanding a city's employment, minority contracting, social services, in ways that made D.C.'s government a direct instrument of black advancement. Culturally, the city pulsed with a distinctive identity. Go-go music, born from the genius of Chuck Brown, became D.C.'s own homegrown sound, a percussive call-and-response funk that never stopped moving and never left town. Shaw, U Street, and the broader Anacostia corridor nurtured black-owned businesses, churches, and civic organizations, and an intellectual life that made the city feel self-sufficient and self-defined. Standing at the intellectual heart of this world was Howard University, the nation's most prominent HBCU, which featured as a crown jewel of black academic and cultural life, training generations of lawyers, physicians, artists, and activists who shaped the city and the broader African diaspora. During these decades, Howard's campus on Georgia Avenue was a gathering ground for some of the most consequential black thinkers, writers, and scholars in the world, reinforcing D.C.'s status not just as a political capital, but as a capital of black intellectual life. Yet Chocolate City carried its contradictions. Poverty and disinvestment shadowed the same neighborhoods that celebrated black power. The crack epidemic devastated communities in the mid to late 1980s, and Barry's administration felt mounting criticism over governance failures, even as his base remained fiercely loyal. The city was simultaneously a symbol of black possibility and a place bearing the full weight of structural inequality. What made D.C. singular was its blackness, and it was the city's center of gravity, shaping its politics, its sound, its street life, and its sense of itself. From MSRC, the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, on the campus of Howard University, I am Dr. Benjamin Talton, and this is On the Yard, a podcast that uses MSRC's archival collections to shape conversation, explore stories, and uncover the ideas that drive change, and celebrate the history and culture that define the global black experience. For this episode On the Yard, I'm joined by MSRC's own Sonja Woods and Howard alum Abdur-Rahman Muhammad, joining me once again. And I'm pleased to be joined for this episode by Professor Derek Musgrove, Associate Professor of History, who is the author with Chris Myers-Ash of Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital. More importantly, Derek Musgrove is my very good friend. Pleased to have you all on.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
All right, so I had that long intro. I know it was long, but I felt it needed to be a little long only because we had to define what we mean when we say Chocolate City. Mm-hmm. Very few people would rightfully use that phrase to describe D.C. today. Now, feel free to contradict me. But Derek, can you respond to what I set up and maybe add some corrections, have some additions, if there's anything that I missed?
So Chris Myers-Ash and I, when we were sitting down to write Chocolate City, really were inspired by the poet Kenneth Carroll's definition of the term Chocolate City. He didn't make it up. D.C. residents in the early 1960s began calling D.C. Chocolate City. And they did so first and foremost because the city had this huge black majority. It's the first major American city in the United States to have a black majority starting in 1957. We're already well into the 60% range by the time we get to the mid-1960s. And D.C. residents just start calling the place Chocolate City in reference to that large black population. It gets picked up by local DJs, black DJs on the black radio stations like WOL. And what they're referring to and what Kenneth Carroll then enshrines in his definition is not just a black majority, because there are plenty of places with a lot of black people that are miserable places to live. because they're exceedingly poor, because they're abandoned, because the police are repressive, whatever. What DC had was a huge Black majority. And at the time that Black folks start using that nickname, it is rocketing towards the return of democracy for the first time in 100 years. And so it's not only going to be a lot of Black people, but it's going to be a lot of Black people who get to elect their own government. So all of our mayors up until the 1870s were white. And then we just didn't have a government for 100 years. Walter Washington is our first Black mayor. He's appointed in 1967. And what's really crucial about distinguishing Walter Washington from his peers, because of course there's two other Black mayors elected in that year. There's Richard Hatcher in Gary, Indiana, and there's Carl Stokes in Cleveland. And there really is a big distinction between those three cities. Cleveland is only about 30% Black. And so Carl Stokes' tenure in office is tenuous. It's not clear if he's going to get reelected. In fact, he barely gets reelected for his second term. And that's because white voters are a controlling interest in that city. He has to keep them happy too. And the reason he's able to get elected in the first place is because a lot of white voters are hoping that electing a Black person will make it so that there's not a riot in Cleveland in the age of long, hot summers. The other place is Gary, Indiana, which, has a massive Black population because of white flight. But it is an increasingly deindustrialized steelmaking town. And so even though it has what's moving very quickly towards a Black majority and a very important, nationally important Black mayor, it's just not a place that has the same sense of possibility as Washington, D.C. It's also a relatively small city. And so D.C. kind of holds this important spot among the cities that are getting Black elected officials. It's got a huge Black population. We're up to about 500,000 by the time we get to the end of the late 1960s. It's a big city. It's a relatively prosperous city because the federal government's here. And so you've got some good government jobs here. And it's moving very quickly towards democracy. And so we get the ability to vote for president for the first time in 1964. We get to vote for school board in 1968, a non-voting delegate in 1971, and then finally home rule. Congress votes to enact home rule in late 1973. We have the actual elections in 1974. And what all that means, though, is that non-voting delegate, that school board, those members of the council and the mayor are all going to be Black, or there's going to be a Black supermajority. And what actually happened was not only that, but the Black supermajority on the council, for instance, is an activist Black supermajority. And so what you essentially have of the 13 council members is roughly 11, including some of the white members, who are either civil rights activists, Black power activists, or anti-poverty activists. So here in DC, you had this remarkable phenomenon where the movement literally took over the government. And that doesn't happen most other places. Typically it's the moderate people who weren't on the streets who are able to benefit from the movement and move into government. Here, we elect the first former Black power activist mayor in the country, Marion Barry, in 1978. And he had already been on the school board and the council, right? So we really were a special place in that regard. And then I'll just add that the third part of the definition, because it's a tri-part definition, you got a lot of Black people, you got a lot of Black people who were controlling their destiny, and you got a lot of Black people making some of the most remarkable art and music in the country. You got Chuck Brown creating a whole new style of music in go-go. And the Black population here is so affluent that it can support that music without going pop. You don't get 3-minute radio edit go-go songs like you do with hip hop. Hip hop starts off like go-go. Songs are 15 minutes long, 20 minutes long, right? They're party songs. But then in order to go pop, in order to get on the radio, they shrink them down to 3 minutes. Bar, hook, right? That never happens with go-go. And part of the reason for that is that Black folks in this area have enough money that they can support the music, live music, without changing it all the way down to today. Aside from go-go, you got people like Amiri Baraka coming in and out of the city pretty much every other weekend to visit the Center for Black Education, one of the most important Black power schools in the country, to visit the New School for Afro-American Thought, which gives birth to about half of the Black Power organizations in the city during the late 1960s. You know, it is just a hub of art and culture and poetry and music. You got Roberta Flack, who's a DCPS teacher, just playing evenings in the upstairs of a bar on Pennsylvania Avenue called Mr. Henry's. I mean, if you look at her first album, the picture from that album is taken at Mr. Henry's. It's just an exciting place to be Black. So it's those three things. It's all of these people, the fact that they're beginning to vote for themselves and put together this really remarkably robust Black Power government. And they're just producing all this artwork. And I'll just add it to put a cherry on top, that Parliament, when it comes out with Chocolate City in 1975, you know, it's really acknowledging all of this. It's saying, look, this is the city where we have the biggest crowds. We do 3 or 4 shows a year and they're all packed and sold out. People shout stuff at us from the crowd and we turn it into songs. I mean, if you look at some of the documentaries on George Clinton, he'll say, you know, I got the idea, I think it was for Get Up on the Downstroke, from a crowd member in DC who's just shouting that at me, right? You know, it's just an exciting place to be Black.
And that's the feeling I had when I arrived here in 1992 as a student. And I want to get a little deeper dive into the culture. But Brother Muhammad, you came earlier than me, so you understood the 80s. When I arrived here, and even visiting my sister, when I first came, I think she was a sophomore. And I was just struck by the pride that DC folks had. It was also kind of the Blackness beyond demographics. And just the slang was different, the accent was different. There was this pride that you all come down with your Levi's and your Timberlands and all that. You got that from us. They were trendsetters, but they bought their items, their clothing from Black-owned businesses in the neighborhood. And they had these unique T-shirts they would wear. There were Black designers in the city. There was a sense of pride that it was palpable. It was pulsating in the city, even in the early 90s as they're hemorrhaging Black folks in the 90s, and we had to deal with crack and all that, but there was still this sense of pride. I know if it wasn't a Howard show and a popular artist came to town, the go-go bands had to close, and the popular artist would open the show. It didn't matter who it was. If it was Tribe Called Quest, if it was Run DMC had to open the show. And then Backyard would close, or Rare Essence would close the show because the folks would leave if Backyard opened the show. You know, that's what I remember. But Brother Muhammad, what struck you about DC in the 1980s? Derek did a beautiful job of setting up the cultural and adding that cherry on top, which is the triple threat of the government and culture, et cetera. What struck you when you arrived here in the early 1980s?
Well, bear in mind that I'm a young man. I'm a kid coming from, of all places, Providence, Rhode Island, the smallest state in the country, 1% African American. If it wasn't a top 40 tune, we didn't hear Black music at all, unless it was like Diana Ross or the Jackson 5 or something like that. But we had to wait until Sunday afternoon when Brown University's station played the 360-degree Black experience and sound, where they have a student, that was their student-run station. And for about 4 or 5 hours on a Sunday afternoon, we could hear what the new Black music was. So imagine when I stepped foot in Washington, D.C. I first came here on a high school trip, I believe it was 78, and 79 is when I actually visited the campus for the first time. And to say it was a culture shock is an absolute understatement. All of these radio stations, no matter where you flip the dial, Black music came out. You turn on the television, the news anchors are Black. The weather person is Black. You're hearing Black music everywhere. Black bookstores, Black little coffee shops.
That's the other thing. The Black bookstores struck me also because we had, for such a relatively small city, we have Derek, 500,000. Probably by the 90s, it was maybe closer in the 400s. But there were Black bookstores and how important Black bookstores were. I remember Pyramid Books up on Georgia Avenue. There was another one in Adams Morgan. And they're just Black bookstores. And they were kind of small cultural centers.
There was one on Euclid Street, right on 14th Street. There was one where, where the 930 Club is today over there. That
That's
was
right.
a very lovely black bookstore. Derek, I can see his face. He remembers. It was alive with black culture. You couldn't escape it.
And that goes back to Derek's point about having such a solid middle class at the time who could first have these businesses and then patronize these businesses, right, Derek? That in some of the city like Gary that's deindustrialized can't sustain that type of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you look at the stores, I mean, Drum and Spear Bookstore, which is, I think, the one that you're speaking of, was on 14th Street, right up by Fairmont. And it was the largest black bookstore by volume in the country in the early 1970s. I mean, they would do, readings with CLR James, who lived down the street on 16th Street and taught at UDC, the predecessor institution of UDC, Federal City College. So you just had all this talent here, and you had these Black Power activists that were willing to create institutions that could showcase that talent. I mean, all that stuff that we experience is part of an activist infrastructure that also had this Black capitalist element to it. And so it was able to sit on the landscape a lot longer than Black Power elements in other cities because it had this large Black population that would support it and these talented activists who were willing to keep it going long after the sort of movement energy of the late 60s had dissipated.
Let's get into Howard University in this era a little bit. I wonder, because we talk about there's this black government. During this period, we have this robust activist community and we have this sizable middle class that punches above its weight class. But how much did Howard University influence this environment as well? You mentioned Roberta Flack, who's a Howard student, Howard grad. Amiri Baraka, also a Howard student, Howard grad, and we can go on and on and on. African Liberation Day had a lot to do with folks in the Howard community as well. So how much did Howard University, man, I go to you, Sonja, Howard University shaping this cultural and political environment during the 1970s and 1980s to make Chocolate City?
What was full circle moment really when you're talking about student activists, especially Marion Barrier or anybody on that council. You have to look at the student activism at Howard and how those activists changed the curriculum of the university, but also influenced college students across the nation to do some of the same things. Also, we can't forget Walter Washington was a Howard alum. So it kind of goes full circle when we're talking about how does Howard influence this popular culture, the demographics, and the city politics. Even in terms of good government job, Howard reinforces a lot of this culture and infrastructure because of the institution that it is.
It was one of the largest employers
Right.
in the city. I think
Correct.
Top four. I don't know what it was in the 70s, but certainly outside of the federal government, obviously, the federal government's the largest employer. But that's the irony, though. The contradiction is that we begin to hemorrhage this kind of iconic black city with a black government, with this activist culture, with a robust middle class. We're hemorrhaging black folks. Derek, what's the years when we really kind of hit the tipping point where black folks are just... And one of the things that shaped my experience is that when I was here as a student, there were so many D.C. residents that had moved to Montgomery and PG County but still owned their homes around Howard University. And that's why the Howard students were able to rent these houses and live in the community because of this black flight from D.C. It's stabilized now. We can't rent these houses anymore because the black folks don't own them anymore, to the extent that they did back in the 80s and 90s. But Derek, what's the tipping point?
So, well, let me make this point really quickly before I talk about the tipping point, because I think that what Brother Muhammad and Sister Woods are pointing out is something really interesting about the late 1960s in D.C., which is that we talk about this sort of bacchanalia of blackness in late 1960s D.C., right? And one thing that I think that language can sometimes obscure is that there's all these different ways of being black in D.C. in the late 1960s. And so there's the sort of hidebound bourgeois that dominates Howard's campus until there's a Black Power movement on campus that kind of dislodges them. There's the radicals in Shaw who are organizing people who are mainly immigrants from North Carolina and Virginia, and who are seen by older Black DC residents as hayseeds and Bamas, right? So there's a lot of different ways to be Black in DC in the late 1960s, and Black folks are fighting about that. I mean, there's all this wonderful ways in which they're collectively being Black, but there's also a lot of ways in which they're fighting over which type of Black will come to dominate this Black metropolis. The point where those folks start to separate from each other in a really profound manner is 1968-69. That's when it begins. And two things happen at that point. The Fair Housing Act is passed right on the backside of the DC Rebellion in April of 1968. And that opens up the suburbs. There are a few Black folks in the suburbs before 1968, but they're not of the suburbs. They're little Black towns that all the suburban subdivisions are sprouting up around. And people in those subdivisions are trying to figure out how to get rid of them, right? Suburbs are white. And after 1968, those suburbs are opened up to African Americans. They're no longer allowed to discriminate against Black folks trying to move across the line. And so the Black middle class, in earnest, begins to head across the line after that legislation is passed. One of the things that begins to drive them across the line is a heroin epidemic, which hits the city terribly hard in 1969. You know, these are folks coming back from Vietnam, hooked on this very strong heroin that's coming out of the Golden Triangle. There had been heroin addicts in the city prior to 69, but they were dealing with this sort of weak Mexican stuff. People used to call it Mexican mud. But this stuff coming out of Southeast Asia, I mean, just created a whole new generation of addicts. And it really destabilized big chunks of the city, including the neighborhoods around Howard University, which became terribly dangerous as addicts began looking for ways to feed their habit, what people at the time called grinding, right? Trying to get some money together so that they could actually go get a new fix. And so you see the Black middle class first moving north, which it had already been doing since the mid-1940s, and then across the line into Prince George's County. And that gets us to a point where by the mid-1980s, Prince George's County is looking at a Black majority itself.
And it's the largest, or maybe to Atlanta suburbs, one of the largest Black middle-class suburbs in the country, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just speaking to what Professor Musgrove just shared with us, that actually was one of the concerns and grievances of the students, that Howard University was aloof, disinterested, unconcerned with the broader Black community. Black people outside of, the Howard circle and Howard family, that there really was a kind of elitism, this ethic of trying to ape white people and to be a white institution. And they were coming up in the era of Black power. They were coming up in the era post-Malcolm, when Malcolm would say, "You're not red, black, brown, or yellow, a so-called Negro, a so-called Negro." He completely disparaged and stigmatized the term Negro and ushered in the term Black. Then you have Stokely Carmichael popularizing the slogan, the mantra, Black Power, Black Power. And so this is, again, Dr. Musgrove mentioned the long, hot summers. We saw 150 American cities struck with urban unrest, urban rebellion, what some would call riots. American cities going up in flames that terrified America. So these students at Howard, they were in this milieu, they looked up and they saw that the university, they said, this is not a Black university. This is a university that just happens to have Black people. If you were to go to the School of Fine Arts, you wouldn't hear gospel, you wouldn't hear blues, you wouldn't hear jazz, because they were not allowed to be played in the School of Fine Art. In the English department, there were no books or literature written, virtually none, by prominent Black writers or Black writers at all. There was no courses on African American history and culture at Howard University.
Let me get into the question of what makes Howard a Black university at the time. And that was part of the point of 68, to reclaim the university, remake it into a truly Black university.
Well, the protest in 68 in the A building was preceded by another protest, the original protest at the Charter Day commemoration March 1st of 1968. This is where about somewhere between 40 and 70 students disrupted the Charter Day. It was very embarrassing, and students were passing out leaflets, and one young lady stood up and said, "This is the end of Howard University. A new black university has been born." And they went up on the stage and they said, "This is the revolution," and so on and so forth. It turned out to be around 39 students who were threatened with expulsion. And it's that threat to expel these students and the very heavy-handed administration where the students, Howard University, it was founded by generals now. Remember that. Howard in the early days was run like a military camp. And it always maintained that kind of authoritarian culture. And students really had no say in the judiciary process and how they would be punished or was sanctioned or what have you. And so that became another, that the university could just expel these students by fiat.
And that was one of their
That was
demands.
one of their demands,
correct?
exactly right. And they wanted Neighborhood to resign. And they also wanted an African-American studies program.
And as you said, College of Fine Arts didn't really have gospel and jazz, and then they start to incorporate that into we get jazz studies out of that.
I just want to add to that because I think it's so important. The events of 68 are in many ways a culmination, right? The culmination of a 3-year struggle. So 66, Stokely Carmichael comes to campus and he's part of a panel discussion. And he's like, y'all need to stop imitating white people. You need to be proud of your blackness. And it starts all these protests that basically keep rolling for 3 years straight. I mean, I have in my research notes that you had about 115 separate incidents over the next 3 years, 66 through 68.
Can we take it back a little further, though? We could take it back maybe even 64, 63 with the law students.
You can, but I think that, when you look at, like, say, the nonviolent action groups bringing people like Malcolm X to campus to debate Bayard Rustin, right? That's still very much in a civil rights vein, and it is not directed at the university. It's directed outward at the segregated society.
Sure.
And 66 really becomes a struggle for the university. It's specifically articulated as we're going to turn a Negro university into a black university. And you have Carmichael saying that explicitly in October 66. And then it just keeps going through 68. And sort of the penultimate struggle is the seizure of the administration building by students, which of course leads to the fall of Neighborhood and the replacement of Neighborhood with Cheek.
Sonja, before you chime in, I want you to set up Dr. Cheek, but also I encourage all our listeners to go to Digital Howard and look at the Hilltops newspaper and the yearbooks for this period. Everything that we're talking about, you see the visuals, you see actually there's an interview with Stokely Carmichael. They have it written out in the Hilltop. He came also in 1970. There's a nice interview with Stokely Carmichael. It's fascinating the ways in which he maintained ties to the university throughout all these years and ties to DC in general. But Digital Howard is a wealth of resources for this period. So Sonja, please, can you do a setup on Cheek, what we need to know about him and his presidency? Then I'm going to turn it over. Brother Muhammad, you're the only one who was a citizen of Howard University under the Cheek presidency. So you can talk about that experience as well. And you're good friends with James Cheek Jr., so you have a personal relationship there as well.
So James Cheek Sr., James Edward Cheek, we have to understand not only was he president of Shaw from 63 to 69, he was a Shaw alum in 1955, and he was a student activist at Shaw. So he's one of the Emmett Till generation guys.
And he's not from North Carolina, is he?
He's from North Carolina.
I'm sorry, see?
So it's okay. So his parents grew up in Roanoke Rapids, which is Halifax County. Matter of fact, it's the first county you come to when you're traveling south on I-95 through North Carolina. But they moved from Halifax County to Greensboro. So he primarily grows up in Greensboro and goes to several private schools. But when he gets to Shaw, he was expelled from Shaw. And he was expelled from Shaw because, and we're talking about Howard as this conservative place. If you were in trouble, there's no board to judge you. You were just out. But this is across HBCUs where ROTC was mandatory. Women had different rules And Cheek was expelled from Shaw because he, as an activist, came in support for a bunch of other his friends who were expelled because they were riding around girlfriend, boyfriend in a car, which is a no-no. They were immediately expelled. No kind of, litigation. You just get a note slid under the door. You can leave, pack up and leave. And so he was an activist with a bunch of his colleagues and was expelled for supporting the fact that these students didn't get their just due consideration for that act. So he goes off to graduate school and ends up teaching, I believe, at Virginia Union. And that's when he was called back to Shaw University as a 30-year-old to be the president. And Shaw was in bad shape. Matter
That's
of fact,
incredible to me. A 30-year-old
president of an HBCU
That's
in
wild.
1963 is kind of crazy. And Shaw was in trouble financially in terms of students. I think when he said he got back there, they had $100 in the bank. He wanted to change the university to Shaw College because he said this is not a university. And so he really got credit for building it. They wouldn't let him change the name. So he got credit for building it back up into his fundraising, the development of the academic units from departments to schools or schools to colleges. He was responsible for all of that between 1963 and 69. And it caught the eye of the Board of Trustees at Howard University.
Are they looking at Cheek before the 68 protests?
Yes.
Or
they're looking at Cheek as early as about 68. So I wouldn't say before, but they're looking at him. And Cheek says that he turned down Howard several times. He met with them, turned them down. This is his alma mater, Shaw. So he wants all of the things that he ended up bringing to Howard. He wants that for Shaw. How he got to Howard is one of the craziest stories I've ever heard in Howard history. He said he was at home. He had met with the board. He had met with several people at Howard, and he was back home in North Carolina. And he was, I think, in the bathroom brushing his teeth or something. And Today Show on NBC announced breaking news: the new president of Howard University will be Shaw's own James Cheek. And he said he about had a stroke.
So he hadn't actually accepted the position.
He turned them down.
Wow.
And he heard that so it was leaked. Turns out this was deliberate,
right?
Because they knew that doing that he would have a problem with the Shaw Board of Trustees, and so
he'd have to go. Well, maybe not have to go, but he'd be under pressure.
He'd be under significant pressure as someone who was doing something because they wined and dined him.
Yeah. Makes sense what he was able to accomplish at Howard, giving that background, given what he was able to do at Shaw. It's not like he's coming from just a small university and doing a decent job. He actually basically had a startup.
He had a startup.
And he reinvented the place. And he comes here to Howard University. I would look around on the yard. We talked a few episodes ago about Dr. Mordecai Wyatt Johnson. And you look at this campus and you can see Mordecai's footprint for sure, what he did. He reinvented Howard University. But also you look around and you see Cheek. I mean, both of these men, I would say you'd be hard-pressed to find another president that made as much of a mark on Howard University as Mordecai Wyatt Johnson and James Cheek. Do you want to correct me, Brother Muhammad?
No, I agree with you.
Co-sign
I absolutely
that?
can co-sign it. And I would even go further. He left such an impact on the university that during his 20-year tenure, 1969, 1989, Howard University conferred 33,000 degrees, okay, in his 20-year period. That's the same number as the previous 100 years. So he conferred 33,000 degrees, which means that he expanded the degrees and the schools and the student population and the budgets to such an extent that he was able to equal the past 100 years of scholarship in 20 years of his term.
Now, how is he able to do that? He's still young. He doesn't really have a DC network. Am I wrong? Is he using the same donors as he has at Shaw? He didn't just arrive with a magic wand. I mean, he was human.
He had a practice.
And no president. He has practice. But what was the ingredient for his success, do you think?
I'll say at Shaw, he talks about how partner might be a strong word, but he counts Republicans who we see as repugnant, even then, as allies. For instance, one of his biggest ally at Shaw to help turn Shaw around was Jesse Helms. And he talks about this. And he says, no, people have a misconstrued, kind of a misdiagnosis, or you're not looking at Jesse Helms in an honest way, is what Cheek would say. And it's very interesting when you think of the relationship. At that time, Jesse Helms was not a politician, but he was a radio specialist. He was a radio announcer. He had his own show. Let's call it a podcast. Jesse Helms had a podcast, and so he would rile people up about different issues. But behind the scenes, he was working with Cheek to help fundraise for Shaw University. So it's very interesting how he continued to not be influenced or impacted by what people thought he was doing, or he would count Reagan and Bush as his personal friends, not just friends of the university. He called them his personal friends.
And these are friendships that developed, obviously, while he's president of Howard University.
Yeah.
While he's president of Howard, but also before.
Okay.
It's just interesting his position in the Republican Party in North Carolina and up in D.C.
And we have to be clear, a Republican in 1980 is
It's a
very
little
different
different.
than a Republican in 2026.
little-
Go ahead, Derek, you want to put some flesh on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Brother Muhammad's numbers are startling, but there really are three things that Cheek has going for him that allow for those numbers. The first is that way more black folks are going to college after the 1960s as were before. You know, if you look at it 30 years before 1960s, 30 years after. And by the way, that's the case for a lot of Americans. College is democratized in the years after World War II, increasingly so. And so he just has that built-in benefit, right? But the other is that this practice of working with segregationists, because that's what Jesse Helms was. And we have to remember that segregationists don't necessarily hate black people. They just want to be dominant in a segregated order.
And
right?
they supported black schools to keep
Because-
them.
And so they support
keep
black
them black.
schools to keep the white ones less black.
Right.
Right. So you have sort of this knowledge of how to work that angle when Cheek comes into Howard University. And he's able to sort of leverage that skill to work with very conservative presidents, Nixon, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and get a lot of money at a time when at least Reagan and Bush are cutting funding to higher education, particularly to black colleges, not necessarily to Howard. And part of it is that relationship. Now, keep in mind, these people need something from Cheek. I mean, Reagan is at the nadir of his relationship with black folks in 1982. And so he starts reaching out to any black person that will be willing to be seen with him to do photo ops.
And very
because
few want to be seen with him.
1982, his approval rating among black people is 8%. So it's the lowest on record since they've been taking polls on that. And it's because he's literally at that moment trying to overturn the Voting Rights Act. And so he reaches out to James Brown, does a photo op with him at the White House. And then he reaches out to Cheek and does a fundraiser at Howard University. And Nancy Reagan does a tour of campus. And it's students' response to Cheek giving Reagan a lifeline that leads to the protests on campus in 1983, among other sort of authoritarian aspects of his governance of the campus, right? So there's working with racists that he had learned in the segregated South at Shaw. There's more black folks going to college. And then contradictorily, there's black folks being genuinely scared of the atmosphere that Reagan had created and deciding after years of moving away from HBCUs to begin to move back toward HBCUs. And so Howard's enrollment goes up under Cheek. He comes in, it's at about 9,000. By the time he leaves, it's up towards 12, 13. Part of that is just because it is increasingly uncomfortable on white college campuses for black folks.
Right. Similar to what they're saying now.
And so all those things contradictorily work towards a really positive tenure for Cheek. And the contradictions finally come due in the late 1980s.
The time is never on our side. We're going to wind down. But Brother Muhammad, were you out there with a placard in 1983? Protesting Reagan coming to campus? He was only on campus for about 15 minutes. He gave a quick speech. Nancy stayed for that dinner, but he gave a quick speech and hightailed it.
I was here at Howard. I don't know if I had a placard, but I was definitely part of that protest. I was part of that movement that took over the A building as well at that year.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to 89. But James Cheek, the person, the man, as you understand him to be, how would you describe him?
I believe he was a man of great character. He had a big vision for Howard University. He understood, as an HBCU, Howard University was really in its own lane. He didn't consider Howard University to be, let's say, competing with the other HBCUs. He saw Howard University as a great institution that could compete with the greatest institutions of the world. And he had a huge vision. His dedication to equity in health care and the medical school and the hospital. He fought great battles, to inaugurate those programs, the sickle cell center and what have you. He loved Black people. He loved his community, but he didn't tolerate nonsense either. He understood his power. And I remember him, I was on the yard, like when Cheek was on the yard, he gave the aura like he was the president of the United States.
I got
You
that
didn't
impression.
just walk up to Cheek. He had a security
Right.
detail, and that was my impression of him. And I'm not the only one,
He was an amazing messenger also, not
he was an
messenger,
orator.
a
He was a great
messenger.
speaker.
Like his PR, his personal PR skills were, Sonja and I talked about this when she turned me on to New Directions magazine. But also when I talk to people from the 80s, I'm sure people in 89, maybe 88 might say something different, but the folks before the protest, before the Lee Atwater debacle, when he was appointed to the Board of Trustees as a Republican, people were very proud to have Cheek as their president.
Mhm.
He made them feel proud, not just of Howard University, but proud of him. And we'll get we'll do a round two. We'll get into, this is a rich conversation. It's no surprise that we're going a little over. I think we could probably go for another, 3-4 hours. We're not going to do that. But Derek, we just lost Reverend Jackson, icon, an oak of a man. We can't talk about Chocolate City. We can get a little more into Marionberry. We gave Marionberry short shrift, but I think we'll have to come back to that. But just Jesse Jackson, his significance to D.C., his importance in this community. When I walk down 4th Street, I pass that house on T Street. That's where the Jacksons have lived, I don't know, for at least 4 decades now. That's the Jackson House that used to belong to Howard University. If we had more time, what are some issues we'd have to get into in terms of Jesse Jackson and Chocolate City?
Yeah, no, the Jacksons bought that house in 85 from Howard. I think they moved in 1990. Look, Chicago is I think, draped in black mourning cloth right now, and rightfully so. Jesse Jackson was a towering figure in American politics, not just in African-American politics. And I'm really proud as a D.C. resident and as a historian of the district to say that this is the only place where he ever held elected office. He was our shadow senator from 1990 until 1996. In fact, we wouldn't even have a shadow delegation if it wasn't for Jesse Jackson. The city had passed a referendum to create a shadow delegation, which was supposed to go up to the Hill to lobby for D.C. statehood in 1980. And the council just didn't want, these elected officials running around without portfolio, with nothing to do but eventually challenge them for their seats. And so they never put forward the money to have the elections. And Jesse Jackson, after his 88 campaign, was considering running for mayor. He decided not to, but he wanted an elected office that would still allow him to be a crusader for progressive policies. Foremost among those progressive policies in his mind was the crusade for D.C. statehood, self-determination for the majority Black district. He had been focused on the issue since 1972 when it was placed in the Gary agenda from the 1972 Gary Convention. And so he not only sort of shamed the council into holding elections for the shadow delegation, but then he ran and was elected one of our shadow senators and was a good shadow senator. I mean, he went up to the Senate every other week and lobbied to get people to sign on to a statehood bill. He actually convinced all of the Democratic hopefuls running in 1992 to go on the record saying that they supported D.C. statehood. And it was only because people like Bill Clinton betrayed him and didn't throw their weight behind, and George Mitchell in the Senate, and didn't throw their weight behind D.C. statehood, that we didn't have a better showing the first time that statehood went to the floor of the House of Representatives for a vote in 1992. Its failure was not Jesse's fault. It was the people who had said one thing to Jesse behind closed doors and then done another thing in pursuit of white conservative voters out in front of the crowd. And so I'm deeply sad that we are losing him, the man, but I'm very proud that we have his example in this city for all the time that we had him here.
No, for sure. And we knew he was sick for some time, sick for a couple of years, even maybe 3 years. And so we knew that we were going to lose him soon. But even when I heard the announcement, it was shocking. And so we could say, he made his mark, and we are the beneficiaries of that.
We got to give a shout out to the students. A couple years ago, one of the last times that Jesse Jackson got arrested was a couple years ago when he came to campus.
Yeah, that's right.
To help students who were protesting against mold and poor living conditions in the dorms at Howard University.
That's right.
And it's
21.
because he loved the chapel. He loved Howard University. He wanted to, even as sick as he was, he wanted to dedicate his body, if not his voice, because he was having trouble speaking at the time.
Yes,
to the ongoing struggle of students to make Howard live up to its name.
Absolutely, to the very end. Now, we didn't talk about Trans-Africa. We gave Marion Barry short shrift. We didn't talk about the anti-apartheid movement, African liberals. I mean, so many issues that we didn't get to. So many. I don't know what I was thinking, believing that we can get in Chocolate City in 40 minutes. So, but Professor Musgrove, Sister Woods, Brother Muhammad, thank you for joining me on The Yard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on The Yard, the podcast of the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, a University FM production, and produced by MSRC's very own Aaron Jacobs. I am Dr. Benjamin Talton. We look forward to seeing you again on The Yard.